Wasn't there some speculation that she was on Epstein's yacht at one point in time? There was like photos with her and Prince Andrew way back in the day when she was like in her early 20s. Wow.
I have to imagine at the beginning, everyone has like butterflies. And then we immediately went into the trenches together. Yeah. Right out of the gate.
And the wife convinces you to leave the royal family. Like, I'm out. I don't need you guys. Which is crazy because don't you just get free money?
Like 6 months into dating. So now 7 years later, when you have a little bit of
Wasn't there some speculation that she was on Epstein's yacht at one point in time? When Joe Rogan said it, the temperature in the conversation changed. It wasn't a declaration, it was a question. But it landed like a match near gasoline because it pulled a name out of the rumor mill that most people avoid touching in public. The moment clipped out instantly, the internet did what it always does, and suddenly every old whisper that had been fading into the background started circulating again, louder and uglier than before. January 2026 was supposed to feel like a reset. Meghan Markle had already survived tabloid cycles, family drama, public backlash, and the kind of scrutiny that never really turns off. And for a while, it seemed like the yacht rumors and the who knew who speculation had finally been filed away as stale gossip. The kind of thing that only lives in comment sections and conspiracy threads. Then a single sentence put it back on the main road. And that's what made it unnerving. Not because it proved anything, but because it reopened the door. Once a platform that massive starts circling questions about yachts, elite social circles, and proximity to disgraced figures, the conversation stops being niche. It becomes a spectacle where allegations and insinuations can spread faster than facts, and the damage can happen even if nothing is verified. Rogan's brand has never been about protecting anyone's image. He follows whatever thread he thinks people are afraid to pull. So the real tension isn't in what was claimed, it's in what his audience thinks the question implies. And once that implication is out there, the narrative becomes harder to control by the hour. The reason her team reportedly went into panic mode isn't because one podcast clip is proof of anything. It's because of what happens after the clip. In the modern media machine, the initial question is rarely the real danger. The danger is the chain reaction that follows when the internet turns curiosity into certainty and suggestion into a storyline that feels true simply because it's everywhere.
Meghan Markle, the only thing she found was a rich, famous husband.
The nearest thing Meghan Markle ever had to a billion-dollar idea was marrying a prince.
That's the Joe Rogan effect. Rogan isn't a tabloid editor who needs access. He isn't a network host who needs approval. His lane is independence, and that independence gives him a strange kind of power. When he puts a question on the table, it doesn't land as a rumor on the fringe. It lands as a mainstream prompt, a topic people feel allowed to discuss out loud. The barrier breaks. Then creators, commentators, and opportunists rush in to fill the vacuum with receipts, timelines, screenshots, and anonymous claims, because attention rewards whoever posts first, not whoever posts accurately. If you're running crisis management for a public figure, that is a nightmare scenario, not because you can't respond, but because responses often backfire. Deny it too strongly and you look defensive. Ignore it and you look guilty. Address it with legal threats and you guarantee the story will live longer than it ever would have on its own. It becomes a trap with 3 doors, and all of them lead to more headlines. And then there's the photos, the alleged images that get described in vague, dramatic language. That vagueness is not an accident. When people say mysterious yacht photos, it's rarely about what can be proven. It's about what can be implied. A blurry figure, a cropped corner, a familiar setting. The kind of content that lets everyone project their own conclusion, while insisting they're only asking questions. That's why the word yacht becomes radioactive. It doesn't have to confirm anything to be damaging. It just has to create a mental association that won't stop repeating. Rogan has been willing to mock celebrity narratives for years, and Meghan Markle has been a recurring target because her story sits at the intersection of royalty, entertainment, branding, and public.
Who destroyed her in-laws' family, whose own family doesn't like her, whose the in-laws obviously don't like her, the public doesn't like her. She's stuck because she was an actress who became a real princess, who wants to be an actress again, but has to continue to pretend to be a real princess.
Public sympathy. The moment he frames her as a manufactured image, critics hear permission. Supporters hear an attack, and the algorithm hears conflict, which means the clip gets pushed harder, not softer. So the panic, allegedly, isn't about one man talking, it's about the inability to control what millions of other people decide the talk means once it spreads. That's the part people keep missing. The danger, at least from a crisis management standpoint, isn't a sarcastic comment or a harsh joke. It's the shift in who is driving the conversation. Traditional media can be negotiated with. Gatekeepers can be reasoned with, pressured, or distracted with a different headline. But when a narrative jumps into an ecosystem that doesn't care about access, status, or relationships, the usual levers stop working. And that's why Rogan becomes such a problem for anyone trying to keep a story contained. If a tabloid runs something messy, there are routes to respond. You can send letters, threaten action, demand corrections, or starve them of cooperation. If a network segment goes too far, you can work the phone lines, push your counter message, line up friendly voices, and recalibrate the coverage over the next news cycle. It's not pretty, but it's familiar. Rogan is different because he's not in the access business. He doesn't need royal proximity, he doesn't need studio invitations, and he doesn't need anyone's approval to keep the machine running. The conversation happens in his lane, on his terms, and the audience treats his curiosity like a cue to investigate. Not responsibly, not carefully, but aggressively and at scale. So when people claim he's digging into Meghan Markle's alleged yacht past or drawing lines through elite social circles, what that really signals is a widening spotlight. It's the idea that old rumors might get reprocessed and recirculated with a new frame, and a new frame can be more damaging than the original claim. Add in any mention of Prince Andrew, and you don't just get gossip, you get a narrative people are primed to treat as scandal by default. Here's what makes the whole thing feel so combustible. None of these whispers are new. Variations of them have floated around for years, mostly in places that didn't carry much mainstream weight. They lived in corners of the internet, in vague insinuations, in threads that were easy to dismiss because they weren't attached to a megaphone. But when a megaphone gets involved, the same material behaves differently. Old rumors don't stay old. They become resurfaced, reopened, re-examined. People start calling it research. They start packaging it as a timeline. And once it's packaged, it becomes shareable, which means it becomes sticky. And that's the pivot point. The story isn't that something brand new was discovered. The story is that the conversation has potentially moved from controlled channels into a chaotic arena where control is the one thing nobody has. So what changed wasn't the rumor itself. What changed was the volume and the source of the volume. A claim can drift for years in obscure corners and never become real in the public mind. But when a massive platform drags it into open air, the story stops being a whisper and starts becoming a test of power. Who can shut it down? Who can keep it contained? Who can force everyone to look away? That's where a name like Kirby Summers enters the conversation. Summers is an author who has written about the Epstein and Maxwell orbit, including a book positioned as an unauthorized biography of Ghislaine Maxwell. In the online ecosystem that feeds off scandal and shadow networks, that credential carries weight for some audiences, not because it proves anything, but because it signals a person who is willing to say what most people will not. And the claims attributed to her are exactly the kind that ignite a frenzy. Not a documented allegation in a court record, but an insinuation built around timing, proximity, and supposed images. The suggestion that Meghan Markle may have crossed paths with Prince Andrew long before her royal era. The framing is always the same: early 2000s, exclusive settings, elite social routes that don't show up on a resume, a location that sounds cinematic, a yacht, a trip, a moment that allegedly exists in photographs. Here's the key point, and it's the part responsible storytelling has to underline. None of this is confirmed by the existence of a claim. A person saying photos exist is not the same as photos existing. Even if an image exists, an image rarely proves the story people want it to prove. But the internet doesn't run on proof. It runs on implication. A photo doesn't need to be clear. It just needs to be suggestive enough to make people argue about what it means. And that's why the next question becomes the only question that matters in a media storm like this. If there were truly images that connected those worlds, why would major outlets avoid publishing them? Was it legal risk? Was it editorial standards? Was it fear of being sued into dust? Or was it something darker, the fantasy that powerful people can bury anything with the right pressure applied? That question is a generator. It keeps producing suspicion. Then you get the other name that shows up in these narratives, Marcus Anderson. Anderson has been publicly associated with Soho House's membership world, and Soho House has long had a reputation as a private networking hub where introductions happen quietly and relationships form off camera. In stories like this, it's rarely about what a person definitively did. It's about what people believe a connector can do. Who gets in, who gets introduced, who ends up in the same rooms. So the story evolves from a rumor about the past into a broader insinuation about pathways. Not one event, but a system. Not one photo, but a network. And once the narrative becomes about networks, it becomes harder to disprove because the claim shifts from facts to vibes, from documentation to how these worlds work. Here's where the narrative tries to turn a rumor into a roadmap, and it does it by focusing on one thing that feels tangible: the connector. In this version of the story, the connector is Marcus Anderson, a name that gets repeated because he's often described as someone who operates behind the scenes in exclusive social spaces, especially within the Soho House universe.
Was planned from the beginning. She denied being interested in the royal family, which she totally was. I know someone who knows the ex-husband who said she had a vision board with Prince Harry.
In a lot of public retellings, Anderson is frequently mentioned as being part of the wider social web through which Meghan Markle and Prince Harry first met. Even setting aside the gossip framing, the reason this matters to the people pushing the theory is simple. If you can convince an audience there was a gatekeeper involved, then you can sell the idea that nothing was accidental. That's the uncomfortable follow-up these narratives lean on. Not did they meet, but who arranged the proximity. Not were they compatible, but who decided this was the right introduction to make. It's an attempt to recast romance as logistics. And in the internet's imagination, logistics always imply strategy. So the argument goes like this. Anderson has been associated with Soho House for many years. And if someone spends a long time in private membership spaces, they inevitably accumulate access, relationships, and a reputation for making introductions. That may be entirely normal in that world, but once a controversy story needs a spine, it uses that normal reality as fuel. It turns knows people into moves people. It turns host rooms into builds outcomes. Then the Kirby Summers layer gets stapled onto it. And this is where the story becomes more speculative, more insinuation-driven, and more difficult to verify. The claim isn't presented as a clear source chain of evidence. It's presented as overlapping circles, elite pipelines, and alleged proximity to notorious figures from that era. The implication becomes the product. And at that point, the audience is being asked to accept a leap. If Meghan had access to certain circles before she was famous, then the meeting with Prince Harry must have been engineered. Not organic, not lucky, but curated. That is the thesis. The Thailand element is used as a pressure point to make the leap feel justified. The way it's framed online is not a photo went viral. It's there are photos no one will publish. That distinction matters because it's designed to bypass the normal process of verification. If the images are supposedly hidden, then nobody can demand to see them. The claim becomes unfalsifiable, which is exactly why it spreads. It's also why the story keeps referencing past misidentifications. When earlier photos circulated and were later said to depict someone else, that should have been a caution flag. But conspiracy narratives don't treat that as a reason to slow down. They treat it as a reason to pivot. They say the debunked images were never the real ones, and the real ones are still locked away. And that's the hook Rogan-style commentary tends to amplify. Not the evidence, but the suspicion that evidence exists somewhere behind a curtain. Once you frame it that way, the conversation stops being about facts and becomes about faith. Who you trust, who you think is protected, and whether you believe powerful institutions would ever keep something damaging out of public view. If you step back, you can see why this particular storyline spread so fast. It doesn't land like ordinary celebrity gossip. It borrows the emotional weight of one of the most notorious scandals of the era and tries to pull a public figure into its gravitational field. And in the court of public opinion, being near a scandal can be treated like being part of the scandal, even when there is no verified proof of involvement. That's the implication people are trading on. If photos existed that clearly placed Meghan Markle with Prince Andrew in a setting tied to the Epstein timeline, the internet would treat it as more than an awkward headline. It would become a narrative accelerant, a reason for people to reframe everything they already believe about social climbing, elite access, and protected circles. But it's important to say this plainly. Claims about hidden photos are not evidence by themselves. They are a story about evidence, and those two things are not the same. So why does the silence theory keep getting repeated? Because it's plausible on the surface. Powerful people do use lawyers. Media organizations do avoid high-risk allegations. Defamation standards are real, and outlets don't publish something just because it would get clicks. Sometimes stories disappear because they're untrue. Sometimes they disappear because nobody can verify them. Sometimes they disappear because the legal downside is enormous, even if parts of the story are accurate. The internet collapses all of those possibilities into one conclusion, which is that someone must be hiding something. And this is where Rogan's style becomes a catalyst. He doesn't need to prove a claim to amplify it. He can just keep asking the same question in slightly different ways until the audience starts doing the work for him, filling in gaps, building timelines, and turning what if into did you hear? That's not a courtroom process, it's a viral process. Then you get the second thread people use to make the broader insinuation feel more patterned. An example that often gets cited in online discussions is an invitation connected to an event like Yacht Week in Croatia around 2016. Party-heavy travel events like that have been described in media and by attendees as chaotic, hookup-oriented, and status-driven. But even here, there's a big leap that keeps getting made. Being invited is not the same as attending. Attending is not the same as doing anything improper, and none of it connects to unrelated allegations unless someone is determined to connect them. Still, the rhetorical power comes from the framing, not this happened, but why does it keep lining up? That framing is sticky because it doesn't require proof, only suspicion. And once millions of people are repeating the suspicion, the public narrative can start taking damage, even if nothing concrete is ever established. So the real impact isn't that one podcaster changes everything with a revelation. The impact is that he changes the scale of the question, and in the algorithm era, scale can feel like truth. Here's why Joe Rogan's involvement changes the temperature of the whole conversation, at least in terms of perception and crisis control. Most rumors live and die based on the messenger. The same claim can feel like throwaway noise when it shows up in a tabloid and feel like a real controversy when it's repeated by someone the audience believes has no reason to protect anyone. That's the pivot Rogan represents. When tabloids float yacht talk, a lot of people file it under the usual mess. Sensational framing designed to farm clicks. When a royal commentator brings it up, supporters call it speculative and critics call it agenda-driven. And when anonymous accounts thread together theories, it gets dismissed as internet paranoia. Those channels all come with built-in skepticism because people assume there's a motive behind the coverage. Rogan's brand is different. His audience expects him to say what other people won't say, and they trust the fact that he isn't dependent on royal access, studio invitations, or polite relationships. Even when people disagree with him, they still treat him like a cultural signal. If he's talking about something, then the topic has crossed into a bigger arena. He's also been through public blowback before, and he kept going. That history matters because it tells his listeners that controversy doesn't automatically shut him up. If anything, they interpret resistance as proof he's stepping on a nerve. So when he raises a question about Meghan Markle and yacht rumors, or asks why certain names keep appearing in the same orbit, the audience doesn't just hear the question, they hear a challenge. And Rogan's most effective move in situations like this isn't to present a neat conclusion. It's to ask a single follow-up that makes the listener feel like they've been kept in the dark. Why hasn't this been investigated properly by mainstream outlets? That question is gasoline because it flips the frame. Instead of debating whether the rumor is true, it encourages people to assume the system is avoiding the truth. It turns the media into the suspect and the audience into the investigators. From there, you get the predictable cycle. Clips get cut, reaction channels pick it up, timelines appear, and every vague claim gets treated like a clue. That's why a team trying to manage a narrative would reportedly feel alarmed. You can threaten a tabloid and hope they move on. You can negotiate with traditional press and try to starve a story of oxygen. But you can't easily apply those levers to someone who doesn't rely on the same ecosystem and whose audience is primed to interpret pushback as confirmation. So the game changer isn't that Rogan proves anything. It's that he changes how many people are willing to entertain the question, and once a question becomes entertainment for millions, the story stops being controllable in the usual way. This is what makes a figure like Rogan uniquely frustrating for anyone trying to manage a narrative. With traditional media, there are pressure points. Access can be restricted. Relationships can be leveraged. Editors can be persuaded to pass on a story because the legal exposure isn't worth it. Even when you can't fully stop coverage, you can often shape the tone, redirect attention, or run the clock until the cycle moves on. That playbook doesn't work the same way here. If reports say Meghan Markle's team went into panic mode, the panic wouldn't be because a definitive allegation suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It would be because the conversation moved into a space they couldn't steer. Rogan can raise a topic in the form of questions, invite guests who feed the speculation, and let the audience do what audiences do. Clip it, remix it, argue about it, turn it into a recurring debate. And the central problem is structural. You can't manage someone who doesn't need your cooperation. You can't cut off access that they never needed. You can't threaten a platform when the audience follows the personality. You can't easily litigate a question the way you can litigate a statement, especially when the person speaking knows how to stay on the safe side of phrasing while still pushing the implication into the room. So imagine what that looks like from the inside of a PR operation. Years of image work, carefully chosen interviews, sympathetic outlets, coordinated messaging, and a strategy built around controlling where the story shows up and how it's framed. Then a single voice with a massive audience sits in a studio and starts revisiting the same set of insinuations from different angles. Not once, but repeatedly with different guests and different framing. That repetition is important. One mention can be dismissed. Repetition creates a pattern in the audience's mind. It makes people feel like if it keeps coming up, there must be something there. That's not logic, but it's how attention works. And then you get the man behind the curtain element that these narratives love, because it gives the story a character who can carry all the implied strategy. Marcus Anderson becomes that character. On the surface, he's commonly described as a senior figure in the Soho House membership world, someone associated with an exclusive network where introductions happen privately and relationships form off-camera. In rumor-driven storytelling, that role gets mythologized. A membership director becomes a gatekeeper. A connector becomes a kingmaker. That's why Rogan-style commentary fixates on him. If you're trying to argue the meeting with Prince Harry wasn't random, you need a plausible mechanism. You need someone who makes things happen. Anderson is the name that gets used to play that role. And that sets up the next phase of the story. Not just what Meghan did or didn't do, but how the rooms work, who gets access, who vouches for whom, and whether the path to a prince was coincidence or curation. Marcus Anderson is the kind of figure the internet loves to build a story around because he fits a familiar archetype. Not the celebrity in front of the camera, but the person behind the velvet rope, the connector, the one who understands the room, who knows who belongs near whom, and who can turn a casual introduction into a life-altering pivot. In 2016, he's often described as being part of the social chain that helped bring Meghan Markle and Prince Harry into the same orbit. Whether people treat that as ordinary social networking or something more calculated depends on what they already believe. But either way, it becomes the hinge point for the questions that Rogan-style commentary thrives on. Not accusations, but curiosity sharpened into a blade. How does someone whose job revolves around membership and social access feel comfortable making an introduction that carries that much consequence? What level of familiarity or trust would make that seem normal? Did he know Meghan well enough to vouch for her character, her intentions, her ability to handle the spotlight? Or was it simply the kind of introduction that happens all the time in elite spaces, where people mix, chat, and opportunities emerge without anyone treating it like a chess move? Those questions hang there because the public rarely gets a clean answer. Royal narratives tend to be polished. Celebrity origin stories get smoothed into something romantic and simple. The messy middle, the social logistics, the who introduced whom, that part often stays fuzzy, not necessarily because it's secret, but because it doesn't fit the fairy tale packaging. And then there's Soho House itself, which adds an extra layer of mystique. Private membership clubs operate on discretion by design. The appeal is controlled access, curated environments, and the promise that the world outside won't see everything that happens inside. Whether or not specific no photos rules are as absolute as people claim, the broader culture is clear. Privacy is part of what members believe they are paying for. That culture creates a perfect setting for speculation. If a place is known for discretion, people assume it must also be known for deals. If a space is private, people assume it must be hiding something. And once that assumption takes hold, a membership director stops being just an administrator. He becomes a gatekeeper in the public imagination, a person who can quietly shape outcomes by deciding who crosses paths. So the story uses Anderson as a mechanism. It suggests that access was curated, that introductions were intentional, that doors were opened with purpose. Whether that's fair or fantasy, it's why he becomes central in these narratives. He represents the idea that in elite ecosystems, nothing is random, and the most important decisions are made long before the public ever sees the result. This is where the story shifts from a single rumor into a broader theory about systems. Instead of focusing only on Meghan Markle, the narrative starts framing the real subject as the network around her. The kind of network most people never see up close but always suspect is running quietly in the background. In the version of events, Rogan-adjacent commentary leans into Marcus Anderson isn't just someone who happened to be nearby when two people met. He's portrayed as a long-term connector, someone whose value comes from knowing who should be in the same room and when. And once you accept that framing, the next leap becomes easy for an audience that already distrusts institutions. If a connector has been building someone's proximity to influential circles for years, then a headline-making relationship starts looking less like luck and more like trajectory. To be clear, that leap is still speculation. Might have introduced, may have facilitated, allegedly connected are not evidence. They're a scaffolding, a way to make a story feel coherent, even when the proof is thin. But coherence is persuasive, and that's why people keep repeating it. Then the lens widens to Soho House itself, because a private membership brand will always attract suspicion when controversy enters the frame. By design, these spaces are about access and discretion. People join because they want curated rooms, curated circles, curated introductions. That isn't automatically sinister. It's just how exclusivity works. But when a scandal narrative is being built, discretion gets reinterpreted as secrecy, and exclusivity gets reinterpreted as insulation from accountability. That's why certain names get pulled in, like Ron Burkle and other wealthy or prominent figures who have been publicly linked, accurately or loosely, to various elite social ecosystems over the years. In these narratives, the details often matter less than the implication. If you can place enough famous or powerful people in overlapping spaces, you can suggest a pattern without ever proving a direct line. And that's the trap the story sets. If Soho House says, "We're just a club," critics respond, then why do so many power players pass through it? If they say, "We don't control what members do," critics respond, "But your product is access." If they deny any specific allegation, the denial itself gets framed as evidence that the machine is protecting itself. So the no-win situation claim comes from that dynamic. A company built around introductions can't deny that introductions happen. At the same time, it has little incentive to invite deeper scrutiny into private membership culture because privacy is part of what members believe they're paying for. And when a massive audience is being encouraged to treat every private room as a potential cover story, even ordinary networking starts getting recast as something darker. And that's why these questions, even when they're framed as questions, can still create an image crisis. Not because they establish facts, but because they paint a picture that's hard to unpaint once people decide they like the story. This is where the pressure builds because institutions hate open loops. A rumor can be fought, an accusation can be denied. But a question that keeps hanging in the air is harder to kill, especially when the person asking it knows how to phrase it in a way that invites the audience to do the accusing for him. That's the core of the Rogan-style approach in stories like this. He doesn't have to declare a verdict. He just has to stack unanswered questions until the silence starts sounding like an answer. From a PR perspective, it creates a bind. If you respond, you risk amplifying the topic and lending it legitimacy. If you stay quiet, people interpret the quiet as fear. Either way, the private world around the story, the discreet rooms, the introductions, the invitation-only ecosystems gets dragged into public conversation where nuance doesn't survive. And the questions themselves tend to follow a predictable pattern. They aren't framed as prove you're innocent. They're framed as explain how this is normal. Why was Meghan in proximity to certain party travel scenes or exclusive events? Not as a moral judgment, but as a social question. How does someone get on those lists and who is doing the inviting? If an invitation existed, what does it actually indicate? Attendance, or just access to a mailing list? A genuine connection, or a one-time outreach that never went anywhere? The story often skips those distinctions because the point isn't clarity, the point is suspicion. Then comes Marcus Anderson, because every narrative like this wants a mechanism. A person who can be cast as the bridge between worlds. The question becomes, how close were they really? Was he simply a friend and social connector the way many people in those spaces are? Or was he a manager of opportunities? Someone who curated proximity with intention? Again, the framing is designed to make ordinary networking sound like orchestration. And then there's the money question, which is always the most emotionally potent because it invites people to imagine a hidden sponsor. How did she afford the lifestyle people associate with elite circles? Could a working actor cover it? Was it brand partnerships, travel comps, friends picking up tabs, invitations that don't require personal spending, or a social environment where costs get absorbed by hosts and sponsors? Those are all plausible explanations in the world of entertainment and high-end events. But conspiracy storytelling doesn't like plausible. It likes clean, dramatic answers. That's why these questions hit. They're specific enough to feel investigative, but broad enough that no public response will satisfy everyone. If you explain, critics say you're spinning. If you refuse, critics say you're hiding. And the longer the questions circulate, the more the audience starts treating the questions themselves as evidence that something must be underneath. The next layer of this narrative is designed to corner the story into a single emotional conclusion. If the rooms were that exclusive, then someone must have opened the door. And once the audience accepts that premise, every question becomes a lead, not a curiosity. So the questions escalate. Why was she present in spaces populated by billionaires, executives, and elite social players? What was the entry point? Was it her career, her relationships, a publicist, a friend network, or a membership culture where invitations travel farther than people assume? And if introductions were part of the engine, who was doing the introducing and why? Then the story tries to anchor itself to a recognizable wealthy name, like Ron Burkle, because wealthy names function like magnets in conspiracy storytelling. Mention one and the audience instantly imagines hidden patronage, secret sponsorship, and quiet influence. But there's an important distinction that gets blurred on purpose. Being in the same social ecosystem or having overlap through a membership space is not the same as having a direct personal relationship. The narrative often treats adjacency as intimacy because adjacency is easier to claim. And then the hammer question arrives, the one that keeps getting repeated because it's simple and provocative. Did she know Prince Andrew before she met Prince Harry? It's a question that feels like it has only two answers, yes or no, even though real life almost never works that cleanly. People can cross paths without knowing each other. They can be in the same places without sharing a conversation. They can be introduced casually and forget it ever happened. But the question is engineered to make nuance look like evasion. That's also why the framing is so effective. It dresses itself up as due diligence. Not I'm accusing, but I'm asking. Not this is proven, but explain the access. And once it's framed that way, any attempt to dismiss it can be portrayed as avoidance, while any attempt to address it can be portrayed as confirmation that it was worth asking. This is the trap a high-profile figure can fall into during a viral cycle. Silence looks like hiding. Response looks like oxygen. And because the questions can always multiply, any statement can become the starting point for a new round. If you clarify one point, the audience demands clarity on 5 more. If you deny something, people insist the denial isn't specific enough. If you get specific, they accuse you of over-lawyering the story. And the most powerful part of this method is psychological. When listeners feel like they reached a conclusion on their own, the belief hardens. It doesn't matter that the conclusion was guided by selective framing. It feels self-generated, and self-generated beliefs are the hardest to shake. So the story doesn't need a definitive claim to keep moving. It only needs the questions to keep circulating, because in the attention economy, unresolved suspicion is a renewable resource. The reason this keeps resurfacing is simple. Unanswered questions are addictive content. If a story has a clean conclusion, it ends. If a story sits in uncertainty, it can be repackaged forever. And when a big platform returns to the same insinuation again and again, the repetition alone starts to feel like weight, like there must be something there even if nothing new has been proven. That's why people interpret silence as speaking volumes, not because silence proves guilt, but because audiences assume that if a simple explanation existed, someone would have offered it. In reality, public figures often stay quiet precisely because engaging can amplify a baseless claim. But the internet doesn't reward restraint, it rewards reaction. Then you get the angle that is rarely discussed with care, what this does to Prince Harry's public image. Harry has already been treated as a punchline in parts of the commentary world, framed as naive, pliable, or emotionally reckless. Rogan and similar voices have leaned into that, painting the relationship as branding, ambition, and optics rather than romance. If the Yacht and Andrew narrative ever became widely believed, whether true or not, it would plug directly into that existing frame. It wouldn't just be a rumor about Meghan. It would become a story about Harry, a story where he isn't the protagonist, but the target. In that framing, he stops being the prince who chose love and becomes the man who didn't see the play coming. The humiliation isn't private, it's mass performed because the public would treat the relationship as a case study in manipulation. And this is the most corrosive part. Even if nothing is verified, the scenario being repeated is damaging on its own. The suggestion that she might have had prior proximity to his disgraced uncle is emotionally explosive because it implies foreknowledge, access, and strategy. It doesn't matter that the claim is speculative, the claim is tailor-made to trigger the exact insecurities people project onto Harry's story, that he was isolated from his family, that he was vulnerable, and that he was guided into choices he now can't undo. So the narrative being sold to the audience isn't just about past social circles. It's about rewriting the origin story of the marriage, turning "we met and fell in love" into "she positioned herself and it worked," turning coincidence into orchestration, turning a private relationship into a public con. And once that frame takes hold, it's hard to reverse because it doesn't rely on one piece of evidence. It relies on a feeling. The feeling that the fairy tale was too convenient, that the meeting was too perfect, that the access was too clean. Rogan doesn't need to prove it to cause damage. He just needs to keep inviting millions of people to imagine it. Once a question gets planted at scale, it doesn't need fresh evidence to keep growing. It just needs repetition and a new angle every few days. That's what makes this kind of storyline so corrosive. It doesn't disappear, it mutates. People start rewatching old interviews with a different lens. They reinterpret past quotes as hints. They treat ordinary social overlap as hidden meaning. And the relationship itself becomes the target. Not because anything new has been proven, but because suspicion changes how a story feels. The picture being pushed is harsh. Harry, as the isolated spare, estranged from his family, stripped of royal protection, living far from the institution that once gave him structure, and now framed as vulnerable to influence.
Out gives this interview in which he not only says he doesn't know how long the king has left to live,
I don't know how much longer my father has. He won't speak to me because of this security stuff.
which the royal family was like, hey, let's not talk about the king's mortality because you don't know, specifically because the king has refused to speak to you since February 2024. Now that is over a year.
In that framing, Meghan isn't simply his partner. She becomes the alleged architect of his transformation, and the supposed elite circle connections are used as the evidence that the transformation was planned. The brutal part is that he can't easily rebut a vibe-based narrative. You can't disprove a hypothetical with a press release. You can't produce a document that erases every possible social crossing. You can deny a claim, but denial rarely satisfies people who already want a darker explanation. And the more he tries to defend the relationship publicly, the easier it becomes for critics to say he's rationalizing or protecting the brand. This is also where people drag the royal family back into the story, because it creates a ready-made twist. If the palace had concerns, then those concerns can be reframed as foresight rather than bias. William and Charles become cautious not because they were controlling, but because they allegedly saw something Harry refused to see. It's a compelling storyline, which is exactly why it spreads, even though it relies on assumptions about what anyone knew behind closed doors. And the narrative does something clever. It takes real tension, the documented family breakdown, the visible distance, the public conflict, and uses it as proof of an unrelated claim. It says, look at the outcome, therefore the origin must have been strategic. That's backwards reasoning, but it's emotionally persuasive because the ending feels messy enough that people want a clean explanation for how it began. So the public frame shifts. In one version, Harry chose love and freedom over an institution that was suffocating him. In the other version, he becomes the man who walked away from everything and didn't realize he was being maneuvered. That reframe is humiliating. And humiliation is sticky content because it turns a complicated human story into a simple morality play. And that's where the Soho House angle returns, because it gives the story a machine. Instead of relying on romance, it relies on infrastructure, a network, a private membership culture, an environment where introductions happen and discretion is normal. In rumor-driven storytelling, that environment becomes the engine that explains everything. Not fate, not chemistry, not coincidence, but curation. So Rogan's focus on Soho House isn't random. It's the mechanism that makes the reframe feel plausible. If you can convince people that the rooms were designed for connection and that the right people were placed near each other on purpose, then the fairy tale doesn't just look naive, it looks manufactured. Most coverage treats Soho House like a lifestyle brand with better lighting. A private club for creative people, a place where actors and entrepreneurs drink cocktails, swap ideas, and keep their meetings off the record. That's the public-facing image, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's also incomplete, because any membership space that sells access and discretion will attract more than artists chasing inspiration. It will attract people who value privacy as strategy. That's what Rogan-style commentary tries to turn into a darker point. The argument goes like this. Soho House isn't just a venue, it's an infrastructure. It's a curated environment where introductions happen organically on the surface, but intentionally by design. The real product isn't the lounge or the restaurant. The product is the room itself, a space where influential people can be in proximity without the friction of public attention. And when you're selling that product, secrecy becomes part of the appeal. The less the outside world sees, the more valuable the inside feels. That doesn't automatically mean anything illegal is happening. It means the social dynamics are optimized for discretion, and discretion always invites suspicion from people who already believe powerful circles protect themselves. That's why wealthy names get pulled into the discussion. Ron Burkle is one that often comes up in online narratives because he is a prominent billionaire and has been publicly photographed across elite social settings over the years. People who want to paint a sinister picture use those overlaps as proof of a hidden system. even when the overlaps don't establish direct wrongdoing. They stack proximity, parties, and acquaintances until it looks like a web, because a web is more compelling than a coincidence. The same logic then gets applied to membership culture itself. The claim becomes, if the club is built on discretion, then it must also be built on untraceable introductions. If introductions are happening, then someone must be curating them. And if someone is curating them, then motives must be involved. That's where Marcus Anderson gets dragged back in. In this storyline, he's not just a staffer or a membership executive. He becomes a symbol of the system, the person audiences imagine controlling the flow of access. The question stops being whether Soho House connects people. It clearly does. That's part of its purpose. The question becomes what kind of connections, for whom, and under what incentives. So when Rogan asks what goes on inside those rooms, he's not just asking about Meghan Markle's social life. He's challenging the legitimacy of the whole model. Private spaces that thrive on discretion have a hard time responding to that kind of scrutiny because explaining too much undermines the very thing members want. But staying quiet lets critics fill the silence with their own version of the truth. That's the bind. If you defend the club as harmless networking, skeptics say you're minimizing. If you ignore the questions, the myth grows. And once the myth grows big enough, every private room starts to look like a cover story, even when it's just a room. This is where the story turns into a pressure test for the whole private network model. A membership brand can comfortably admit it connects people. That's not a scandal, it's the pitch. The problem starts when the public tries to audit the connections, because an access business isn't built to explain its inner workings in daylight. That's why this becomes a no-win scenario in the rumor narrative. If a club says, yes, we facilitate community and introductions, skeptics respond, great. Then who was introduced to whom and why? If the club refuses to engage, skeptics treat the refusal as proof that the introductions are too sensitive to discuss. Either way, the same thing happens. The mystique becomes the story. And that's where Marcus Anderson gets positioned as a symbol rather than a person. In the speculative framing, he isn't a one-off actor doing his own thing. He represents a function. The idea that there are professional connectors who can shape proximity at high levels. If that function exists, people assume it must be deliberate. If it's deliberate, they assume it must be strategic. And once you get to strategic, the romance story becomes the target because the official version is simple and appealing. Two people meet through mutual social overlap, they connect, the rest becomes history. It's a narrative that fits in one paragraph and sounds human. The alternative version being pushed is longer, darker, and more compelling to an audience primed to distrust institutions. It says the meeting wasn't chance, it was curation. It wasn't chemistry, it was positioning. It reframes the relationship from a love story into a case study in elite networking. And once that reframe spreads widely, the fairy tale doesn't just lose shine, it becomes a liability. Every old detail gets reinterpreted. Every photo from that era gets reread as proof of access. Every friend in the background becomes a possible facilitator. The narrative becomes self-feeding. So why can't Meghan Markle easily fight back in this kind of cycle? Because the allegations being circulated are often designed to be resistant to rebuttal. They rely on insinuation more than documents. They use questions instead of claims. They point to connections instead of verifiable events. And they borrow the credibility of exclusivity itself. The idea that the most important things happen in private rooms, where the public will never get a clean receipt. If she stays silent, critics treat silence as hiding. If she responds, the response becomes content and the topic gets amplified. If she denies a specific point, the story shifts to another point. If she explains the normal reasons someone might have access to high-end events in entertainment circles, people call it spin. It's a cycle that doesn't end because it isn't built for resolution, it's built for engagement. That's why these rumors lingered for years without breaking into wider conversation. They lived in low credibility spaces where most people shrugged and moved on. The problem in this storyline is that now the rumors are being discussed in a higher visibility arena where even questions can feel like verdicts. And once millions of people are trained to view the origin story through suspicion, restoring the original frame becomes nearly impossible. For years, this kind of talk lived where most people keep it, on the edges, in gossip spaces, in niche royal watcher circles, in threads that never made it into the center of the culture. Even when it popped up, it didn't stick, because the messenger mattered as much as the message. People could shrug and say, this is noise. The dynamic changes when a megaphone repeats the noise often enough that it stops sounding like background. That's why the Rogan factor keeps coming up in this narrative. Not because he delivers a verified investigation, but because he changes the distribution. A rumor can survive forever if it keeps finding new audiences. And a platform that can deliver millions of listeners on demand doesn't need fresh evidence to keep a topic alive. It only needs an angle, a guest, and a new way to ask the same question. From the perspective of reputation management, this is the nightmare version of a media cycle. The standard tools are built for outlets that want something from you. Tabloids want access or leverage. Networks want interviews. Publishers want relationships. Even hostile coverage can be influenced because the ecosystem still runs on exchange. Rogan's world runs on the opposite. He doesn't need access, and his audience often treats the lack of access as a badge of honesty. If someone tries to pressure him publicly, his listeners interpret the pressure as proof he hit a nerve. That's why the silencing storyline is so potent. The attempt becomes the evidence. So what does a team do when the usual playbook backfires? Silence becomes the default, not because it's satisfying, but because it's the least terrible option. Engage and you amplify. Threaten and you validate the persecution narrative. Deny and you invite more follow-ups. Explain and you get accused of spinning. In a cycle fueled by insinuation, every response becomes new content. Silence also buys time, and time is often the only real weapon in viral scandals. The hope is that attention shifts, a new controversy arrives, and the algorithm finds something fresher to obsess over. But the risk is obvious. Silence can be interpreted as fear, and fear can be packaged as confirmation by people who want the story to be true. That's the bind. When the conversation is driven by questions instead of claims and spread by people who profit from conflict, the right move isn't about truth. It's about which choice creates the least oxygen for a narrative that was built to keep breathing.
How are Prince William and his wife Kate Middleton responding?
They're done. They're done. William doesn't even want to hear Harry's name anymore. He's just kind of like, don't bring him up. We're good.
Silence sounds clean on paper. In practice, silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled fast. If a massive platform keeps circling the same set of insinuations while the person at the center refuses to engage, a lot of viewers don't interpret that as restraint. They interpret it as avoidance, not because that's fair, but because the internet reads quiet as guilt when it's already in the mood to suspect. That's the flaw in the waited out strategy when the story is being kept alive by repetition. A response is risky though, because it can serve as confirmation that the topic matters. The second you address it, the clip becomes "she responds," and the story gets another life. So the team is boxed in. Engage and amplify. Ignore and allow one-sided framing to harden. And the power dynamic is what makes it feel so lopsided in this narrative. Meghan Markle has the conventional toolkit, attorneys, PR, relationships with outlets that can present her side sympathetically, and a carefully managed public voice. Rogan has something different: scale, frequency, and the illusion of unfiltered authenticity. A long conversation feels real to listeners in a way a polished statement does not, even when the conversation is speculative or incomplete. It feels like you're hearing the truth because you're hearing the process, the hesitations, the jokes, the offhand remarks. That format advantage matters. It's easier to make a suspicion feel reasonable over 2 hours than it is to dismantle it in 2 paragraphs. Then comes the double standard frame, which is effective because it flatters the audience. It tells them they are the only ones willing to ask what others are afraid to ask. It turns the listener into the hero and the media into the villain. Why does she get a pass? Why isn't this investigated? Why does the machine protect certain people? The reality is more boring and more complicated. Media outlets weigh risk, especially legal risk. They avoid allegations they can't verify. They make editorial calls based on sourcing, not just audience curiosity. But that explanation doesn't satisfy an audience that already believes the system is selective. And it doesn't satisfy people who want a scandal story to have a clean antagonist. So the double standard angle keeps working because it doesn't require new information. It only requires the belief that the coverage should be harsher. Once that belief is planted, every lack of mainstream amplification becomes proof of protection, and every attempt to ignore the story becomes evidence that something is being hidden. That's why Rogan keeps pushing it. The goal isn't to land one definitive claim. The goal is to lock the audience into a frame where the absence of confirmation is treated as confirmation of the cover-up. The double standard argument is where this story tries to turn suspicion into righteousness. It stops being framed as gossip and starts being framed as a free speech test. Why can't people ask? Why does this subject feel off limits? Who decided certain questions are unacceptable? That reframing is powerful because it changes what the audience thinks they're doing. They're no longer entertaining a rumor. They're challenging the rules. And once a listener feels like they're being told what they can't talk about, the curiosity hardens into certainty. People assume a taboo must exist for a reason, and they rarely imagine the reason could be boring, like legal standards, lack of evidence, or editorial caution. This is also where the conversation gets weaponized. If a journalist digs in and gets criticized, that criticism can be described as proof that the subject is protected. If an outlet avoids an allegation because it can't be verified, that caution gets described as a cover-up. If someone points out that certain claims have been false before, the correction gets reframed as defense of a powerful person. The narrative becomes self-sealing. Anything that would normally slow a rumor down gets repurposed as evidence that the rumor is dangerous to the powerful. So when Rogan asks, why is this off limits? He's doing something more effective than arguing the details. He's attacking the boundaries around the conversation. And once the boundaries are the target, you don't need new information. You just need to keep repeating the idea that the public is being managed. From there, the path is predictable. The topic doesn't have to be resolved. It just has to be revisited. New guests, slightly different angles, and the same set of insinuations dressed up as fresh concern. The audience keeps hearing it, and familiarity starts to feel like validation. If it's still being talked about, people assume it must be real. Meanwhile, the person at the center of the story is stuck with asymmetric options. She can't force a megaphone to stop. She can't easily rebut speculation without amplifying it. And she can't satisfy an audience that has already been trained to treat any denial as spin and any silence as guilt. The system is built so that the questions keep winning even when the facts don't move. And that's the most important point about reputation damage in the attention economy. Proof helps, but it isn't required. What's required is a trusted messenger, high repetition, and a frame that makes the audience feel like they're uncovering something on their own. Once the narrative shifts in that direction, the story becomes less about what happened and more about what people believe could have happened. And beliefs, once they harden, are much harder to undo than headlines. This is what a modern reputational hit looks like when it's driven by scale instead of proof. One influential voice doesn't need to deliver a verdict. He just needs to introduce doubt in a way that feels reasonable. Then let the audience do the rest. Once millions of people begin connecting dots, the dots don't have to be accurate to become sticky. They just have to feel like a pattern. And the hardest part is that patterns are not easily undone. You can correct a detail, but you can't easily erase the feeling that something doesn't add up once that feeling has been planted and repeated. At this point, the conflict isn't even framed as true versus false. It's framed as answerable versus avoided. Can Meghan Markle outlast the questions? Can her team keep a lid on a topic that lives comfortably in long-form conversation and short-form clips at the same time? Because Rogan didn't need to accuse. He only needed to start a loop. Why was she invited to certain exclusive events? Who was vouching for her? How did she end up in rooms that most people never see? What exactly was Marcus Anderson's role in her social world before Prince Harry entered the picture? Why did the introduction happen, and why did it happen with such confidence? And the most provocative question of all, did she ever cross paths with Prince Andrew before the relationship became public? Here's the reality. Some of these questions are reasonable on their face. Public figures do end up in elite spaces, and curiosity about how access works is normal. But the way these questions are being used matters. They aren't always asked to get answers. They're often asked to imply answers, and that's why responses rarely satisfy anyone. If she answers, critics treat it as spin. If she doesn't, critics treat it as hiding. So the story turns into a referendum on silence. The audience is invited to interpret restraint as guilt and denial as confirmation that the topic is worth pursuing. That's a rigged game, and it's why it spreads. Where it goes next depends on one thing: repetition. If the questions keep returning, the belief hardens. If attention moves on, the loop weakens. But the broader takeaway is clear. In the attention economy, reputation damage doesn't require a proven allegation. It requires a compelling frame, relentless distribution, and an audience that feels like it discovered the conclusion on its own. And that's the choice being presented to viewers in the end. Are these questions being asked in good faith, with a real interest in how elite access works? Or are they being used as a socially acceptable way to keep insinuations alive while avoiding accountability for making a direct claim? And that's the real danger in all of this. Not a smoking gun, not a confirmed photo, not a definitive accusation. The danger is the atmosphere that gets created when a massive voice keeps asking the same questions, and the people who could shut it down choose silence. Because in 2026, silence doesn't read as restraint. It reads as strategy. It reads as fear. It reads like someone is trying to wait out the storm instead of answering it. And once the public starts reading your silence that way, the facts stop being the main event. The perception becomes the story. Joe Rogan didn't have to prove anything to shift the ground beneath Meghan Markle's image. He just had to make millions of people feel like there's a locked door they're not allowed to open. And when people think a door is locked, they don't walk away. They push harder. They search longer. They assume the lock exists for a reason. That's why this saga won't end neatly. Even if nothing new ever surfaces, the questions have already done their damage. Prince Harry doesn't just get dragged along, he gets reframed. The marriage doesn't just get criticized, it gets rewritten. And Soho House doesn't just look exclusive, it starts looking like an engine people want investigated. That's the shift, from gossip to suspicion, from suspicion to storyline, from storyline to a permanent stain that follows every headline after it. So now it comes down to one reality. If there's nothing there, the silence is still costing them. And if there is something there, the silence was never going to save them anyway. Because once a narrative this big escapes into the wild, you don't get to control what it becomes. What do you think? Are these questions legitimate? Or is this just the internet using a megaphone to turn insinuation into truth by repetition? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more deep dive breakdowns like this, follow BarzBuzz and stay locked in. If this saga had you shook, wait till you see what's next. You already know what it is. BarzBuzz got the real, raw, and unfiltered breakdowns. So don't forget to like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to catch up.